In this video, we're going to look at how changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply can lead to economic growth. But we're going to start by just refreshing a few basic concepts that are key to this topic. First of all, we know that gross domestic product is the money value of all goods and services that are produced within an economy. And we also call this GDP at current prices. The problem is, if prices go up, then it looks like GDP is going up. But unfortunately, it might just be that prices are going up and that no more is being produced in our economy at all. So if we want to really understand if our economy is growing, if we're producing more, we need to use the concept of real GDP. And real GDP looks not at the price so much, but at the volume, because it adjusts that GDP at current prices, it adjusts it for the effect of changes in the price level. So real GDP is also known as GDP at constant prices, and real GDP gives us a much better comparison from one year to the next about whether we're producing more or not. So economic growth is the rate of increase in real GDP or real national income. Let's just look a little bit more closely at how that works. So we have here a hypothetical example of an economy operating over a 4-year period. And we can see we've got information about the inflation rate, the population, and the rate of growth of GDP. So when we look at this, first of all, it looks as though GDP in this economy has grown by 3% in the first year, but 5% in the second year, and so on. However, if we think about this a bit more closely, in year one, although the money growth in the economy was 3%, inflation was actually running at 4%. So it means that all of this growth and more was down to an increase in prices. So in actual fact, the growth of real national income was minus 1%. It actually got smaller. So what we've done there is we've taken the rate of growth and we've just simply subtracted from that the inflation rate. In year two, there was 3% inflation. So the rate of growth started at 5%. If we reduce that by 3%, we end up with a 2% growth. However, if we're thinking of real national income per person, per capita, we also have to take out the population growth to get a good comparison. So all we're doing here is we're taking out the effect of rising prices so that we get a better comparison of real growth over time. So what is it that determines economic growth? Well, according to the UK government, what you see here is adapted from a Treasury paper. The Treasury distinguishes between temporary effects on growth and more sustained effects on growth that happen over a longer period of time. So the first paragraph talks about changes in things like consumer and business confidence, changes in aggregate demand, the kind of things we talked about in the last video, and the conditions of the UK's trading partners and government policy. All of these things have mainly a temporary effect on growth. But there are other changes in our economy, such as a growing population or changes in productivity. We'll explain that more later. These have more longer lasting effect, and they help to determine the growth rate over a longer period of time, the more sustained growth in an economy. So we're going to look at each of these in turn, the short run economic growth and then the long run economic growth. So just to summarise there, short-term growth is the annual percentage change in real national output with the effect of prices taken out, remember? But long-term growth is shown by an increasing trend or an increase in the potential GDP of the country. So this long-run economic growth is a long-term expansion of the potential for our country or our economy to produce more and more. And we can see that illustrated quite clearly here on a business cycle diagram. If we look at the blue line, that shows us actual output over time, and we see that on the blue line, growth is short-term, isn't it? We get short-term increases in growth followed by short-term declines in growth. So we get booms, and then we get the economy slowing down, and then we get perhaps a recession, and then the economy recovers. So actual GDP in the short run goes up and down according to differences in aggregate demand. However, the trend shown by the green line is generally upwards, but the red line shows us our maximum potential, the total potential that we could achieve in our economy. If we want long-run economic growth, that red line has to move upwards. The potential needs to increase. So, sources of economic growth in the short run. This is going back to our previous video. This is all about those components of aggregate demand. So in the short run, we'll get economic growth if consumers spend more, if businesses invest more, if governments spend more, if we can sell more exports, or if we can reduce our spending on imports. We know that the aggregate demand formula tells us that if any of these things happen, we'll get short-run economic growth. So let's go back to a diagram that we were introduced to right at the beginning of this module. If you remember, this is the production possibility frontier diagram, or the production possibility curve. And if you remember, this yellow line represents the maximum we can produce in our economy if we use all of our resources, all of those factors of production. If we use them all up and we use them in the most efficient way, then we'll be producing on this line here. However, very few economies will ever produce right on their maximum, because there's always likely to be some factors of production that aren't being used, like some land or maybe some labour, maybe we've got some unemployment. So it's usual for an economy to be operating just inside the Ppf, as we see here at point A. So short-term economic growth is often characterised by falling employment, so we're using more and more of our factors of production. Factories might be expanding and operating for longer periods of time. So what's happening with short-term economic growth is the economy is moving closer to the Ppf. We're moving closer to the point where we're using all of our factors of production in an efficient way. And it's that growth of aggregate demand that is usually driving that movement. So that's short-term economic growth. By contrast, long-run economic growth is driven by slightly different things. It's driven by things like more labour coming into our economy. If we get migrants coming into our economy, we've got more people to do the work, we can therefore produce more. We've got greater factors of production, and therefore our potential to produce has increased. So we've got a bigger quantity of a factor of production here, a bigger quantity of labour. On the other hand, if we can improve the quality of those factors of production, either by research and development or innovation that help us to produce more machinery, more innovative ways of doing things, or we can train our labour force and educate our labour force so that they can produce more, then we're increasing the quality of our labour force and increasing productivity. All of these things mean that our economy now has the potential in the long run to produce more and more on a more sustained basis. And I just want to show you this little graph which illustrates really well, I think, that relationship between UK labour productivity and the economic cycle. So the red line we're looking at here, the reddish brown line, is real GDP. The blue line is labour productivity. And look how closely they mirror each other. So when labour productivity falls, GDP tends to fall. When labour productivity goes up, GDP tends to go up. So why does that happen? Well, I've got a nice little video clip here, which I hope will show you and explain to you really well why this happens.
How does a farmer go from this to this? The most immediate reason that some countries are rich is that their workers are very productive. So how do workers become productive? Well, they work with more and better factors of production. That's the first piece of the puzzle. Rich countries, they have a lot of physical capital and a lot of human capital. And that capital is organized using the best technological knowledge. By physical capital, economists mean tools in the broadest sense. Shovels, tractors, cell phones, roads, buildings. More and better tools make workers more productive. Human capital is tools in the mind, or the stuff in people's heads that makes them productive. Human capital is not something we're born with. It's produced by an investment in education, in training, in experience. Technological knowledge is knowledge about how the world works, such as an understanding of genetics, soil composition, chemistry. This is the research that informs the books that our farmer reads. The final factor, a factor which is often taken for granted, is organization. Human capital, physical capital, and technological knowledge, they've got to be brought together. They've got to be organized in a way that produces valuable goods and services. In a capitalist society, it's the entrepreneurs who bring ideas, people, and capital together in order to produce valuable products. So rich countries, they have a lot of factors of production.
So we see there that long-term economic growth requires either an expansion, in other words, a bigger quantity of those factors of production, or an improvement in those factors of production, better quality. And that's what we saw in that short video clip, that rich countries are able to invest in better capital resources. They're able to invest in their human resources so that labour and capital is more productive. It produces more. So, as we did with short-run economic growth, we can illustrate this using a Ppf diagram. But what we see here is not so much a movement towards the Ppf, but an actual shift in the Ppf itself. We see in this diagram that the whole production possibility frontier has shifted out from the yellow line to the red line. And what this means is that production is increased of both goods and services. We're not having to make less goods in order to make more services, that opportunity cost idea. Instead, because we've now got more resources, more factors of production, or perhaps better quality factors of production, we can now produce more of everything. And now that we can produce more of everything, that means there's more jobs for people, there's better wages, and that should lead to rising living standards. So, let's just recap and summarise. Short-term economic growth tends to be cyclical. It goes up and down. And it does show us changes in real GDP, and it's mainly driven by changes in aggregate demand, whether that's consumer spending or investment or government spending or exports. It can also be driven by short-term changes in aggregate supply. There can be short-term external shocks to both demand and supply. For example, if there is particularly bad weather, supply is likely to go down for the whole of agriculture, or maybe there's another natural phenomenon. We might also see short-term economic growth vary according to government policy, which could improve it or make it worse. On the other hand, long-run economic growth is a growth or an increase in the potential output of a country or an economy. It means the trend growth is bigger now. And that's because we've either got a greater quantity of factors of production, or those factors of production have become more productive. Our labour is more productive, our capital goods are more productive. And this comes from technological progress and also enterprise. It might come because of changes in the labour force if we have a greater population, and it might come from long-run changes in investment. Okay, we're going to finish there. There are a few questions now for you to answer.